All right, guys, we're on chapter 3, Thomas Mann's Death in Venice. It's very long, probably do about 15 minutes. Several matters of a practical or literary nature kept the eager traveler in Munich for some 2 weeks after that stroll. But finally, he instructed his servants to prepare his mountain cottage for his arrival in 4 weeks. And on an evening between the middle and the end of May, he boarded the night train to Trieste, spending only 24 hours there and then sailing to Pola the following morning. What he sought was an exotic and unfamiliar locale that nevertheless could be reached quickly, and so he opted for an Adriatic island that people had been praising for several years. Situated not far off the Istrian coast, it had beautifully jagged cliffs facing the open sea, and it was populated by rustics wearing colorful tatters and speaking a language full of outlandish sounds. However, it kept raining, the air was oppressive, and the hotel was filled with a self-contained group of Austrian provincials. Furthermore, there was no way of establishing a peaceful and intimate rapport with the sea, the kind of relationship provided only by a gentle sandy beach. All these annoyances were not conducive to making him feel that he had found what he was looking for. He was haunted by an anxious longing to move on, but he did not know where. He studied boat routes, he cast about for an idea. And then all at once it was both surprising and self-evident. He saw his destination before him. If you want to get to an incomparable place overnight, a place of fairy tales, a place like none you have ever known, where do you go? Why, that was obvious. What was he doing here? He had gone astray. That was where he had wished to be. He lost no time in announcing his departure from this wrong place. One hazy dawn, some 10 days after his arrival on the island, a swift motorboat ferried him and his luggage back across the water to the naval base, where he disembarked and then instantly walked up a gangplank to the wet deck of a steamship that was about to weigh anchor for Venice. It was an ancient hulk of Italian registry, outmoded, sooty, and dingy. Upon boarding ship, Aschenbach was immediately approached by an unclean, hunchbacked sailor, who with grinning courtesy propelled him inside to a cavernous, artificial, illuminated cabin. Here behind a table sat a goateed man with the physiognomy of an old-time circus director, his hat askew over his forehead and a cigarette butt in the corner of his mouth. Grimacing and gesturing easily and officiously, he recorded the personal data of the voyagers and made out their tickets. Venice, he echoed Aschenbach's request, stretching out his arm and thrusting his pen into the mushy dregs in a slanting inkwell. Venice, first class, here you are, sir. And he scrawled something, bestrewed it with some blue sand from a box, poured the sand into a clay bowl, folded the paper with bony yellow fingers, and continued writing on the outside. A wonderful choice, he prattled. Ah, Venice, a fabulous city, a city that's irresistible to a man of culture, both for its history and for its present-day appeal. There was something numbing and distracting about his glib, swift motions and his empty chit-chat, as if he were worried that the traveler might waver in his decision to go to Venice. The man quickly took the money, and with the nimbleness of a croupier, he dropped the change on the stained tablecloth. Enjoy your visit, sir, he said with a theatrical bow. It's an honor to serve you, gentlemen, he cried, beckoning with a raised arm as if business were booming, although there was no one else asking to be accommodated. Aschenbach returned to the upper deck. With one arm propped on the railing, he gazed at the idlers loitering on the dock to watch the boat set sail, and then he looked at the other voyagers. On the foredeck, the second-class passengers, men and women, were squatting on their crates and bundles. A group of excited young men populated the main deck, clerks from Pola, apparently on a group outing to Italy. They raised quite a fuss about themselves and their excursion, jabbering, laughing, and smugly enjoying their own gestures and movements. Leaning over the railing, they yelled smug and sarcastic remarks at their fellow clerks, who came striding along the avenue on business, clutching their briefcases under their arms and shaking their slender canes at the vacationers. One man aboard stood out, wearing an overly fashionable pale yellow summer suit, a red tie, and a flippantly up-tilted Panama hat. Encircled by a colorful scarf, he was out whooping, out roistering everyone else. But no sooner did Aschenbach focus on him than, somewhat shocked, he realized that this was a bogus youth. The man was old, there was no doubting it. He had wrinkles around his mouth and eyes. The matte carmine of his cheeks was rouge. The brown hair under the straw hat was a toupee. His throat was stringy and scraggly. His thin turned-up mustache and the imperial on his chin were dyed. His two full rows of yellow teeth, which he showed when he laughed, were cheap dentures, and his hands, sporting signet rings on both forefingers, were those of an old man. Horrified, Aschenbach watched him and the way he associated with his friends. Did they not know, not realize that he was old, that he had no right to wear their colorful, dandyish clothes, no right to pretend he was one of them? They clearly took him for granted. They were used to him, tolerated him in their midst, treated him as one of their own, gladly responded to his teasing and returned his pokes in the ribs. How could they? Aschenbach cupped his forehead with his hand and closed his eyes, which were burning for lack of sleep. It was as if things were not quite normal, as if a dreamlike alien nation were spreading out, a bizarre warping of the world which he might be able to halt it if he could cover his eyes a little and then look around again. But at that instant he began to feel he was floating, and glancing up in irrational alarm, he noticed that the bulky, gloomy boat was slowly easing away from the brick jetty. Amid the to and fro of the engine, the strip of dirty and iridescent water between dock and ship was widening inch by inch, and then, after some clumsy maneuvering, the steamer turned her bowsprit toward the open sea. Aschenbach crossed over to the starboard side, where the hunchback had set up a deck chair for him, and the steward in a spotted tuxedo asked if he wished to order anything. The sky was gray and the wind damp. The harbor and the island had been left behind, and all land vanished quickly from the hazy field of vision. Flakes of coal dust bloated with moisture descended on the swabbed deck, which would not dry. Within an hour, a canvas shelter was put up because it was starting to rain. Shrouded in his coat, a book in his lap, the voyager rested, and the hours slipped by him unnoticed. The rain had stopped, the awning was removed, the full circle of the horizon was visible. Under the dreary dome of the sky, the tremendous disk of the bleak sea stretched out all around. But in empty, unarticulated space, our senses lack the ability to measure time, and so we drowse in the immeasurable. Strange, shadowy figures, the elderly Danny, the goateed official from below decks, flashed through the mind of the resting man, with vague gestures and tangled, dreamy murmurs, and he fell asleep. At noon he was summoned to a light lunch down in the dining salon, which was virtually a corridor lined with the doors of the cabins. He ate at the head of the long table, at the foot of which the clerks, along with the old man, had been carousing with the jovial captain since 10 a.m. The meal was pitiful, and Aschenbach quickly polished it off. He craved the open air, the sky. Would the sky be brightening over Venice? Nor had he imagined that it would not, for the city had always given him a radiant welcome, but sky and sea remained dreary and leaden, and misty rain came down at times, and he resigned himself to reaching a different Venice by water than he had ever found when approaching it by land. He stood at the foremast, gazing into the distance, watching for land. He remembered the melancholy yet enthusiastic poet for whom the Tourettes and Coppolas of his dreams had once risen from these waves. He softly repeated the reverent words of joy and grief that had become a measured song. And moved effortlessly by sentiments already shaped, he examined his own earnest and weary heart, wondering if some new inspiration and confusion, some late adventure of the emotions, might not be laying in wait for the traveling idler. Then on the right, the flat coast hove into view, the sea bustling with fishing boats. The resort island, the Lido, floated by on the left as the ship slowed down and glided through the narrow harbor, which is named after that island. In the lagoon, facing poor and jumbled houses, the ship chugged to a halt since it had to wait for the health department's barca. It took the medical inspectors an hour to show up. The voyagers had arrived and not yet arrived. They were in no hurry, and yet they were nervous and impatient. The young clerks from Pola, patriotically drawn, no doubt, to the blare of martial bugles from the public gardens across the water, had come on deck, and inflamed by the Asti, were yelling hurrahs at the drilling Bersaglieri. But it was repulsive to see the state to which the dandified old man had been reduced by his sham association with youth. His old brain had not withstood the wine as resiliently as the frisky brains of his young companions. He was wretchedly drunk. With the moronic gape, a cigarette in his trembling fingers, he stood there lurching, laboriously keeping his balance, pulled forward and backward by his intoxication. Since he would have fallen down at his first step, he did not dare stir from the spot, but he was deplorably exuberant, buttonholed anyone drawing near, babbled, giggled, winked, raised a beringed and wrinkled forefinger in silly teasing, and the tip of his tongue licked the corners of his mouth in a revolting, suggestive way. Aschenbach glared at him and was again overwhelmed with a sense of numbness, as if the world were showing an uncontrollable tendency to become bizarre and gargoyle-ish. However, circumstances prevented him from indulging in that sensation, for the engine resumed its pounding, and the ship, whose course had been interrupted so close to its destination, continued through the Canal di San Marco. And so we saw it once again, that most amazing of landing places, the dazzling composition of fantastic architecture that the Republic presented to the worshipful gazes of approaching mariners, the airy magnificence of the Doge's palace and the Bridge of Sighs, the columns depicting lions and saints on the shore, the splendid and projecting flank of the fairy tale temple, the view of the gateway and the gigantic clock, And while contemplating this scene, he mused that arriving at the Venice railroad station by land was like entering a palace through a back door, and that one can only do as he had done, sail across the high seas in order to reach the most improbable of cities. The engine stopped, gondolas thronged around the boat, the gangplank was lowered, custom officials climbed aboard and discharged their duties perfunctorily. The disembarking could begin. Aschenbach indicated that he needed a gondola to take him and his baggage to the pier of those small steamers that ply between the city and the Lido, for he planned to stay by the sea. His request was sanctioned, his wishes were hauled down to the surface of the water, where the gondoliers were squabbling in the local dialect. He was hindered from descending, impeded by his trunk, which was being arduously pulled and lugged down the rung-like steps. And so for a few minutes he was unable to escape the obtrusiveness of the ghastly old man who was dimly driven by liquor to do the honors of ushering the stranger out. "We wish you the happiest sojourn," he bleated while bowing and scraping. "May you retain fond memories of us. Au revoir, excuses, au bonjour, Your Excellency." His mouth drooled, his eyes shut. He licked the corners of his mouth, and the dyed imperial below his senile lip bristled upward. "Our very best," he babbled with two fingertips on his mouth. "Our very best to your sweetheart, the sweetest, the loveliest sweetheart." And suddenly his upper lip denture fell on his lower lip. Aschenbach was able to shake him off. "Your sweetheart, your fine sweetheart," he heard the slurred hollow cooing behind him as he clambered down the gangplank, clutching the rope railing. Who would not have to struggle against a fleeting thrill, a secret timidity and anxiety upon boarding a Venetian gondola for the first time or after a long deprivation? That strange vessel coming down intact from the days of troubadours and so peculiarly black as only coffins can be, recalls hushed criminal adventures in a rippling night, and it recalls death even more, a bier in a dismal burial, and the final silent voyage. And have you noticed that the seat in a gondola, the coffin-black armchair with its dull black upholstery, is the softest, most sumptuous, the most lulling seat in the world? Aschenbach realized this upon settling down at the gondolier's feet, across from his ample luggage which lay neatly arranged in the beak of the craft. The rowers were still squabbling in raucous, unintelligible voices with ominous gestures, but the special huss of the water city seemed to take their words up gently, disembody them, scatter them across the sea. It was warm here in the harbor, breathed on by the tepid puff of the sirocco. The traveler leaned back into the cushions, into the unresisting element, closing his eyes and delighting in this sweet and unusual indolence. The voyage will be brief, he thought to himself, if only it could last forever. Swaying quietly, he felt himself gliding away from the throng, from the tangle of voices. How still and stiller it became around him. Nothing could be heard but the splashing of the oar, the hollow slapping of the waves against the beak, which loomed over the water, steep in black, its tip like a halberd. And something else was audible, a murmuring, a muttering, the whispering of the gondolier who was talking to himself through his teeth in fits and starts, the sound squeezed out by the labor of his arms. Aschenbach glanced up, a bit surprised to see that the lagoon was widening about him, and that they were heading toward the open sea. Plainly he could not relax all too much. He would have to make sure that his wishes were carried out. "Take me to the steamboat pier," he said, turning halfway. The murmuring stopped. He received no answer. "Take me to the steamboat pier," he repeated, turning all the way around and peering up into the face of the gondolier, who stood behind him on the elevated stern, looming against the wan sky. He was a man with a disobliging, even brutal physiognomy, dressed in sailor blue with a yellow sash, a shapeless straw hat which was starting to unravel, perched flippantly askew on his head. His facial structure, his fluffy blonde mustache, and his short upturned nose made him look anything but Italian, although his build was frail, so that you would not have thought him particularly suited for this job. He pulled the oar energetically, committing his entire body to each stroke. Now and then the terrible strain made him curl back his lips, baring his white teeth, puckering his reddish eyebrows. He gazed over his passenger's head as he retorted in a staunch, almost crude tone, "You're going to the Lido." Aschenbach countered, "Right, but I want to take the gondola only as far as San Marco. I wish to transfer to the Vaporetto." "You can't transfer to the Vaporetto, senor." "And why not?" "Because the Vaporetto doesn't carry luggage." That was true, Aschenbach remembered. He fell silent, but he was quite offended by the man's gruff and presumptuous manner. Someone liked the way his compatriots usually treated foreigners, Aschenbach said. "That's my business. Perhaps I want to check my luggage." "You will please turn around." Silence, the oar splashed, the waves thudded against the prow, and the murmuring and muttering resumed. The gondolier was talking to himself through his teeth. What could the traveler do, alone on the water with this strangely defiant, eerily decisive man? He saw no chance of getting his way. Besides how softly could besides how softly he could rest if he did not lose his temper. Had he not wished that the trip would last a long time, that it would last forever, it would be wisest to let things take their course, and above all, it was highly pleasant. A spell of indolence seemed to emanate from his seat, from his low armchair with its black upholstery, so gently cradled by the oar strokes of the high-handed gondolier behind him. The notion that he may have fallen into the hands of a criminal floated dreamily through Aschenbach's mind, but it failed to galvanize him into active resistance. More annoying was the possibility that the man was simply trying to squeeze extra money out of him. A sense of pride or duty, a memory, as it were, that this had to be prevented, enabled Aschenbach to pull himself together. He asked, "How much do you charge for the ride?" And looking beyond him, the gondolier replied, "You will pay." There was an established rejoinder to this. Aschenbach said mechanically, "I will pay nothing, absolutely nothing, if you take me where I don't want to go. You want to go to the Lido, but not with you. I'm rowing you well." "That's true," thought Aschenbach, relaxing. "That's true, you're rowing me well. Even if you're after my cash and you hit me from behind with your oar and send me down to the House of AIDS, you will have rowed me well." But nothing of the sort happened. They even had company, a boatload of musical waylayers, male and female, singing to a guitar and mandolin, riding obtrusively bow to bow with the gondola and filling the stillness of the waters with their mercenary poetry for foreigners. Aschenbach tossed money into the hat they held out. The buskers now fell silent and rode away. And again he heard the disjointed whispering of the gondolier, who was talking to himself in fits and starts. And so they arrived, lolloping in the wake of a steamer bound for the city. Two police officers, their hands on their backs, their faces towards the lagoon, were pacing to and fro on the shore. Aschenbach climbed on the jetty, helped by the old man who, armed with his grappling hook, is a fixture at every Venetian jetty. And since the traveler had no small bills, he went over to the hotel by the steamer pier to get change and pay the rower as he saw fit. He was taken care of in the lobby. He returned. He found his belongings in a cart on the dock, but the gondola and the gondolier had vanished. "He took off," said the old man with the boat hook. "A bad man, a man without a license, Signor. He is the only gondolier without a license. The others called up here. He saw that we were watching for him, so he took off." Aschenbach shrugged. "He rode for free, Signor," said the old man, holding out his hat. Aschenbach threw in some coins. He directed his baggage to the Hotel de Bains and followed the cart along the avenue, the white blossoming avenue which, flanked by booths, taverns, and rooming houses, cut straight across the island to the beach. I think we should stop there. I think we'll stop there. Wait, let me keep going. So he entered the spacious hotel through the back from the garden terrace, strode through the enormous lobby and the vestibule, and stepped into the office. Since he had a reservation, he was received with officious courtesy. The manager, a short, quiet, polite, indeed flattering man with a black mustache and in a French frock coat, rode up with him to the third floor, where he showed the guest to his room, a pleasant room, furnished in cherry wood and decorated with strongly fragrant flowers, had lofty windows offering a view of the open sea. When the manager withdrew, Aschenbach stepped over to one window, and while his luggage was being brought in and put away, he gazed out at the beach, which was deserted in the afternoon, and he peered at the sunless sea, which was at high tide now, sending long, low waves to the shore in a calm, even rhythm. All right, so he's in his room now. So he decided to go to Venice. He decided to change route and spontaneously go to Venice. And now he's in Venice. And now he's in his room. And that's where we'll leave it off at. We're still on chapter 3, which is a long chapter. It goes all the way to goes all the way to 328. So maybe another video and a half. Maybe. I don't know. Peace, y'all.